G'day, welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to go through a basic talk about triggers in rifles. Then I suppose I'll go through a few different details to make sense of it. For the very simple side of things, I'll start with an overview of the three main triggers you're going to find, and they are single stage triggers, two stage triggers, and set triggers. Basic explanation of them: a single stage trigger is a trigger that largely is designed with no movement. It has, I'll demonstrate on this one here, it is a trigger that just doesn't move at all. So there's no movement there. When you actually put any pressure on it, it fires. So very little movement in this sort of trigger. More of a target trigger, can be found anywhere, but that's the simple operation of that trigger. A two-stage trigger has some movement. It's not free play, but it has some pressure that you come back on until you get to your trigger point, then you push through and then it fires. A set trigger is a trigger that has some mechanism that takes it from and it can be dual, or it can be two-stage or single stage, but it has a higher pressure for one setting. Then you change something, whether it's a button, whether you push the trigger forward, whether there's another trigger on the rifle, whatever it is, you do something to the rifle and that lightens the pressure so it fires easier. So there's less pressure once you've done whatever it is, once you've set the trigger. So those are the three main triggers, I should say. The next thing we talk about when we talk about triggers is the trigger weight. I mentioned about trigger weights there, but you have varying trigger weights for various reasons. Trigger weights is the amount of pressure it takes to actually fire the trigger. In a two-stage trigger, then there's two trigger weights. There's the weight of the trigger as you pull it back onto your break point, and then there's the weight of your break point in your trigger. Break point is talking about when the trigger fires. And your trigger pressures range from, some rifles in some situations will have what we would consider ridiculously high at 12 pounds and things like that. Your average trigger weights are going to range between around the 6 pounds down to around the 2 pounds. That's your average trigger weights. You do get heavier and you do get lighter. For someone who's inexperienced, then heavy is a better place to start. As you can imagine, triggers that go off accidentally are not as safe as triggers that go off with only being deliberate. There's lots of trigger discipline to learn and all that sort of stuff to make sure your finger's never near the trigger unless you're ready to shoot and all the rest of it. But there's still that other piece that applies, is that the more deliberate it takes to pull the trigger, so the more weight there, tends to be the safer way to do things. And in that way, the trigger weight side of things is very relevant when you're talking high action or other conditions, other things going on. Then a little bit more weight is a nicer way to be. For the likes of hunting, then you're really in that around the 3 pounds, 3 to 4 pounds is a really nice trigger weight. It gives you still a light enough weight to where you can be nice and consistent, but a heavy enough weight to, with high heart rates and with different conditions and different shooting positions and things like that, you can pick up your trigger quite easily without accidentally fumbling and firing when you weren't ready. And I'll get into a little bit more about some of the things that light trigger weights can also cause, which are not what people might expect. But in that sort of place, hunting, competition, tactical, that side of things, then a higher trigger weight, and also generally a two-stage trigger is probably a better option, or a lot of people like it. You can use other ones, that's not set in stone, but the two-stage side of things lets you get onto your trigger and lets you actually squeeze back on. I like to think of it as sort of lean on the trigger. I can get on that, get onto this, go onto the actual trigger with a little bit of pressure, ready to break the shot or break the trigger, ready to fire the shot. But that little bit of extra weight gives a little bit of extra confidence in those high stress, high heart rate situations, and in the rapid running of a bolt in a tactical situation or a competition situation, when you want to ram your bolt fast and get back onto your trigger quickly. It's nice to have that trigger weight up a little bit so you can actually find your trigger at high speed and pull through when you want to, rather than finding your trigger and actually firing the trigger because the trigger weight was too light. So that's your hunting side of things and your trigger weight that goes there. And as said, normally a 2-stage trigger. You come back down into a lighter weights and more into target shooting, more stable platform, more time to do things. Then your weight tends to come down. You tend to be looking for the fact you don't need that extra pressure, a little less pressure, everything's running a little gentler, a little slower, a little less weight tends to suit. And in some cases you'll also find a little better accuracy out of backing that thing off. And then that tends to be moving into, some people still prefer 2-stage, but coming into single stage where single stage works. I tend to use a single stage and I tend to be down on the 1 pound. But most of my shooting is done in a very stable platform. So I'm running a bag, I'm running prone, very stable, nice, confident, plodding along sort of shooting, and that trigger weight starts to work there. And then you get below that. You go into bench rest stuff, you go into some of the situations where people run down in the less than half a pound. And I suppose a little bit of my conversation is to stress some relevant features, features that I think are relevant. And that is, listen, that does work for some people, and running super light pressures does work for some people. But it is a very individual thing, and I suppose what I really like to point out is it doesn't work for everyone. And lighter isn't necessarily better. There is a point where certainly I've found that place where there is a little bit of feeling, if I get better triggers and I get them down lighter, then that'll be better. No, there is a point where getting too light can cause issues. And those issues are ultimately you can end up with a lack of confidence out of the fact the trigger's too light. And I suppose more than anything, what I'm trying to say is there isn't more accuracy out of going lighter. Light enough is as accurate as it gets. Now, like I said, personal preferences, but I've certainly been in a situation, and I'm sure most target shooters and people that push the boundaries have been in a situation, we've gone a little bit lighter, or I've been in a situation where I've set a trigger and a little while later on that trigger gets lighter and lighter, and it gets to the point where all of a sudden it's got too light. And what's too light in my opinion? There's two things. One, as said, if you want to run your bolt, you want to go a little bit faster, you want to pick up your trigger a little bit faster, you'll find, and to be truthful, anyone who's been there has found this, whether they want to admit to it or not, is that you get to a point where when you're trying to pick up your trigger, you fight around. Now, done properly, you will go into the trigger because you're already on target and everything's pointing in the right direction, but you weren't actually ready to fire the shot. And in picking up the trigger, you've hit it. Now, that can be a simple case of, okay, doofus, do that right. But the truth of it is, you'll find in most situations, that'll start the beginning of a lack of confidence in your shot. When you're worried about picking up that trigger rather than just doing it naturally, that can start to lose a bit of confidence in what's actually happening there. So what I'm really saying without me going too far into it is, what I did say is there's no point in going too light. Once you're light enough, once it's working, it's all feeling nice, you're not moving things around, and that's what you're heading for, is that you want to be able to pull that trigger without influencing the gun in any fashion. There is into what grip you're using, where your thumb sits, whether you're a full grip on a pistol grip, or all the ways you can do this. That's another thing. We're talking about trigger control. Unlike trigger discipline, which is where your finger is when you're not trying to shoot. But those are all things you should learn. Probably there's places where you could say it's easier to learn really good trigger control with a little bit heavier trigger. But I suppose this would be the crux of my conversation, is that I've actually found with a good trigger and more the cleanliness and the precision and the consistency of the break is probably more relevant to accuracy than the pressure of the break. Yes, lighter can help sometimes, but lighter still doesn't help, and more of the paint, the more experience I've got, and the more which I would want to share, is that although consistently shooting 1 pound and 1.2 and 1.1 pound triggers, I've also shot good rifles with 3.5 pound triggers, which the accuracy is the same. So there's a little bit in your rifle and your platform and all that sort of stuff, and there certainly is a comfort place that you want to find for you, but keep in mind that there is a place, there's, in my opinion, running a 1 pound trigger in a tactical gun is going to end up with issues in that situation. There are weights versus what you're doing. So listen, that's a basic nutshell, types of triggers, trigger weights, where to use both those sort of things, whether it's dual stage or single stage, all this can go in any place. The other thing I haven't touched on, and I don't feel as relevant to the conversation, but that's different brands. Lots of very good triggers. I tend to use the Kelvin Elite, but that's simply because I've got found something that works. It's easy for me to get, and I use it because of that. Used all sorts of other triggers as well. And whether they're ball bearing or whether they're bushed or whether they're precise, I suppose what I'm going to say without getting too technical about it, the feel of it, the consistency of the break is what's important to me. You want really good bits and pieces, you want that brand, there's other things that does it for you. Listen, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But don't get too hung up on having to buy the $700 trigger because someone else uses it for this, so I need it in my rifle. Well, listen, it's about you, and like I said, being able to go down to 2 ounces isn't a relevant detail in my mind. Nothing wrong with getting that one, but make it make sense and keep it to where it actually fits. A little bit more weight can actually make a better shooter out of you than going a little bit less weight. Ultimately, the right weight's what you're chasing. So anyway, that's that bit. The next bit I wanted to go into, and really, how do you get that trigger weight? And I suppose that's what I'm really talking about here. 2 sides to it. One is the people who are doing their own trigger jobs and think that they can do that. Listen, some people probably can. Some people have the expertise and have done that. Some gun tests, and I say some because I mean that, only some do have that. Know all equipment, know the job, know all the details to go with that. In most cases, good trigger jobs are done by very few individuals. And in most cases, with the average rifle, in the main brands, you can just buy a trigger. And to be honest, that would be the option I would suggest. Spend a little bit more money and go and get yourself a good trigger. You don't need to wreck the trigger you had. That goes in the shelf, and that can be for later on or for a different rifle or whatever it is. But in most cases, spending some money on a good trigger is a good adjustable trigger, gives you that flexibility, and it's all done. All that polishing and all the work and all the bits and pieces inside, whether it's redesigned or whatever, is done in a simple bolt-in form. Yes, you can do work to triggers, and some are better than others. In my opinion, the likes of the Remington trigger, I just replace them. I don't bother working with the Remington trigger. Not about safety things. The safety thing is probably relevant to what I'm talking about. And that is where people have taken a factory trigger and taken it, adjusted it, because there's adjustment screws on it, adjusted it below where it is actually recommended to operate at. And that's one of the bits I'm talking about here, where people do their own polishing and change an angle a tiny bit, or people do the adjusting and go outside specifications. People take them outside where they work. Triggers aren't as simple as adjust them to whatever weight. They're made to operate at certain pressures, spring pressures. They're made to operate with certain angles on. They're made in a fashion to work. Generally, a factory trigger, as I started, is made to operate in that 5 pounds, maybe only 3 pounds, but somewhere up there, back down to around 2 pounds. Once you take a factory trigger below that weight, which is conceivable, you can adjust them, you can mess them different forms. In most cases, you might get a trigger that's okay, but generally they'll lose consistency. And that consistency, in my opinion, is more important than that trigger weight. The other side of it is safety. Big deal, really big deal. When you go too low, and in the gunsmith world, we have ways to do things in the way of testing, with drop testing and all the rest of it to make sure things are safe. But in the truth of it, once you go below that point, it might pass all its tests for that moment, but you want it to be right for the next as long as you have that rifle. You don't want that weird situation to end up where that rifle goes and you become another bad statistic for our industry and for yourself. So to a degree, if you're not trained to do this, don't mess with those things. If it does have a set of specifications, stay inside that. It isn't just bureaucrats being awkward. It is about trying to make it to where it works. And I suppose safety aside, it's very important, but put it to the side, consistency and confidence in your rifle is what's going to make you more accurate and work better for you. And I did say some gunsmiths. Yeah, listen, I mean that. Not all gunsmiths know how to do this. This is, to some degrees, a dying art. There's stuff that lets people know so much, to know all the intricate details inside every trigger, how they're actually working and all the rest of it. But in some cases, we have to go there. In some cases, there isn't any choices. So, because you can't get an aftermarket trigger. In that situation, do your research. Find the people that actually do these rifles. Find that sort of stuff. Be wary of seeing how to do it on the internet. I get it. I get YouTube can teach us all everything, but when it comes to messing with the trigger, be really wary of that, because getting it wrong could be very expensive in more than one way. Anyway, listen, I suppose that's it. I wanted to leave with a nutshell of giving people an idea for the real novice of where trigger weights and trigger styles work for you. And I also wanted to come back to that going too low isn't necessarily always the best option, but more than anything, for the guys that are messing with their own stuff and out of trying to get that lighter trigger weight, be very wary of that. Be very careful. And certainly, if someone has done their own messing with their trigger and given it to you to use, listen, pass on that. Not worth it. Needs to work really well, need to be confident in things. Both safety and reliability and accuracy are all very relevant in that conversation. Anyway guys, hope that's worth something to you. Catch you next time.
Hi guys, Sam here. For folks that are interested in our products that you will have seen in our videos, these are all products that Mark has designed through our experience in ELR shooting. We manufacture them here ourselves. The likes of our adjustable bag bases, bag riders, bipod systems, muzzle brakes, shot data recording sets, and even our great fun little 22 long rifle target. These are all available on our web store, the links to which are below this video, along with our contact information. And guys, we work hard at putting these videos together, so we appreciate all the help we can get. For those of you who haven't subscribed, don't forget and hit the bell so you get notifications of when our videos come out. It would be awesome to get some financial support. So for those of you who can, you can purchase support bits on our web store, which help us bring these videos to you. Thanks for watching. See you next time.